Good evening. Welcome back to Quiet History. Tonight we're going to London. Not the London of today, but the London beneath it. The one buried under 2,000 years of fire and plague and conquest and rebuilding. Dim the lights. Get comfortable. Let's begin.
Picture, if you will, an ordinary afternoon in Trafalgar Square. Pigeons scatter across the worn stone flagstones as a red double-decker bus rumbles past on the far side of the road. Tourists gather at the base of the great bronze lions, resting their hands on the cool, weathered metal. Posing for photographs they will look at only once or twice before forgetting. Somewhere above them, Nelson stands atop his common, gazing out over the rooftops of a city he could never have imagined, growing so vast. The fountains hiss and splash, sending a fine mist into the grey London air, and the National Gallery watches over it with its pale columned face, patient and unmoving, the way old buildings often seem to be. It feels, in this moment, like the very centre of the world, and in a sense it is. Nearby Charing Cross has long served as the point from which distances to London are officially measured, the invisible zero from which the entire map of the city unfolds outward like ripples on the Thames. Black cabs idle at the crossing. Commuters hurry past with their heads bowed to their phones. It is, in every visible way, a thoroughly modern place. And yet, beneath the polished stones, beneath the fountains and the plinths and the patient stone lions, something far older waits in the dark, something that has nothing to do with admirals or empires or the 19th century at all. In the 1950s, during building work in Trafalgar Square, workers digging into the earth came upon something unexpected. Not pipes, not old foundations, bones, the fossilized remains of creatures that, at first glance, seemed impossible to associate with London at all. Cave lions. Wild cave lions. Wild ox. And strangest of all, the bones of hippopotamuses and rhinoceroses, buried deep beneath what is now one of the most recognizable public squares on earth. These were not the remains of animals that had wandered from some distant zoo, nor creatures brought here by sailors on some Roman or Georgian ship. These bones were far, far older than that. They dated back to a warm interglacial period, a temporary thaw between ice ages that occurred roughly 120,000 years ago. During that distant epoch, the climate of southern Britain was not the cool, damp, grey climate we associate with London today. It was closer, in some ways, to the climate of the African savannah. The Thames, then, was not a tamed river held in by embankments and bridges. It was a wide, wild, braided waterway, spilling generously across a broad valley, its banks soft with marsh grass and reeds. Try, for a moment, to hold both images in your mind at once. On one side, the London of today. Glass towers catching the last light of a winter afternoon, black cabs idling at the crossing, the low murmur of a global city going about its business. On the other, a hippopotamus wading through the shallows of a wide, sunlit river, its great grey back breaking the surface of water, where taxis now wait at a red light. It seems almost impossible, and yet the evidence lies still beneath the pavement, quiet and patient, exactly where it was left. How did a warm, marshy river valley, once roamed by rhinoceroses and lions, come to be paved over, built upon, and transformed into the beating heart of a global empire. How does a city forget its own deep past so completely that most of the millions who pass through this square each year have no idea what lies beneath their feet? To answer that, we must go back, not simply a few centuries, not even a few thousand years. We must go back far further than that, long before there was a London, long before there was even a Britain in the way we understand it today. We must go back to a time when this land was simply a stretch of unnamed wilderness at the edge of a much larger continent, and the river we now call the Thames was only just beginning to carve its long, patient path toward the sea. Let us begin, then, at the true beginning. Long before Trafalgar Square, long before London itself, long before the very idea of England existed, there was simply the land and the river and the slow turning of centuries into ages. Humans first arrived on the landmass we now call Britain a very long time ago, indeed perhaps as early as 800,000 years before the present day. In those early ages, Britain was not even an island. It was joined to the European mainland by dry land, a wide plain of tundra and forest that people and animals alike could simply walk across, following the herds, following the rivers, following whatever drew them onward across an unmarked and unnamed world. We cannot know for certain, but it seems likely that early humans were moving through the area we now call London, hundreds of thousands of years before any settlement bore that name. Scattered evidence exists of stone tools, worked flints, and occasional human remains, hinting at fleeting visits, temporary camps, small bands following the rhythm of the seasons along the riverbank. There was no city here yet. There was not even the concept of a city. There was not even the concept of a city. There was only the river, wide and slow, and ever-present, cutting its way through a landscape of marsh and gravel terrace, forest and open plain. Picture that ancient Thames if you can. Not the narrow, embanked river of today, hemmed in by stone walls and iron railings, but a broad, braided network of channels spreading generously across a wide valley floor. In warmer periods, like the one that left those bones beneath Trafalgar Square, the banks would have been thick with reeds and rushes, the shallows churned by the feet of elephants and rhinoceroses, the deeper pools patrolled by creatures we would now associate only with far warmer climates. In colder periods the land would have frozen hard, the river slowing to a crawl beneath sheets of ice, the great beasts retreating or perishing as the temperature dropped once more. This was a landscape that breathed in and out across tens of thousands of years, warming and cooling, flooding and freezing, entirely indifferent to the tiny bands of humans who occasionally passed along its edges. As the centuries turned into millennia and the millennia turned into whole epochs, the climate slowly settled into something more familiar to us. The great ice sheets retreated northward for what would be the final time. Sea levels rose. Britain became, at last, an island, cut off from the European mainland by the cold, grey waters of what we now call the English Channel. And along the banks of the Thames, human life began to change in a fundamental way. During the New Stone Age, roughly between 4000 and 2200 years before the Common Era, communities across Britain gradually abandoned the wandering life of the hunter-gatherer in favor of something more settled. People began to farm the land, to till the soil, to plant crops with patient, repeated labor, rather than simply gathering what nature happened to offer. They began, too, to domesticate animals, keeping herds close by rather than following wild game across the landscape. It was a slow transformation, unfolding gradually across many generations, but it changed everything about how humans related to a place like the Thames Valley. The river was no longer simply a source of fish and fresh water to be visited in passing. It became something closer to a neighbor, a constant presence around which a settled life could be built. By the time of the Bronze Age, the area that would one day become London likely consisted of a loose scattering of small farming settlements spread along the river banks and across the surrounding low hills. Sheep grazed in the fields. Cattle were kept for milk and meat and labor, and a relatively new addition to daily life had arrived as well: the domesticated horse, an animal that would change the pace and reach of human life along this river forever. Then came the Iron Age, beginning around 700 years before the Common Era, and with it a further quiet transformation. Horses were no longer simply ridden or kept for status. They were harnessed to pull carts and wagons, opening the land to a new kind of movement. Trade routes began to stretch further than ever before. Goods moved not only along footpaths, but along trackways worn smooth by wheels and hooves. The people living along the Thames in this period were, for the first time, meaningfully connected to a wider world, beyond their immediate valley, to other communities across Britain, and through them, distantly, to trade networks reaching across the sea to the European continent. It is worth pausing here gently to notice something, even at this early stage. Long before any Roman ship had crossed the Channel, long before any wall had been built, or any bridge constructed, the essential ingredients of London's future were already quietly assembling themselves. There was the river, wide and navigable, offering a natural route both inland and out to open water. There was the fertile workable land along its banks, capable of supporting settled agricultural communities, and there was a growing web of trade and travel slowly drawing this corner of Britain into contact with a wider world. London, in other words, was on the very cusp of existence. The land waited, patient as it had always been, for something or someone to recognize what this particular bend in the river might become. We do not know the names of the farmers who tended fields along the Thames in those final centuries before the Roman arrival. We do not know what they called the river, or whether they had any name at all for the low hills and marshy banks that would one day bear the weight of a great capital city. Their wooden huts have long since rotted into the earth. Their trackways have been paved over so many times that no trace remains visible to the eye. And yet, in a quiet way, they were already shaping what was to come. Every field they cleared, every path they wore into the earth, every small trading connection they maintained with communities further afield was laying an invisible groundwork for the city that had not yet been imagined. This too is a pattern worth noticing. Early fall, it will return again and again throughout London's long story. growth building quietly upon growth, generation laid gently over generation, until something new and unexpected emerges from what came before. It happened first with the shift from wandering hunter-gatherers to settled farmers. It would happen again and again in ways far more dramatic as the centuries went on. But for now, in this earliest chapter of the story, there was no London yet. There was only the wide Thames Valley, its marshes and gravel terraces, its scattered farms and grazing earths, its quiet trackways leading toward a horizon no one could yet see clearly. The great beasts whose bones would one day be found beneath Trafalgar Square were already long gone by this time, vanished along with the warm interglacial world they had inhabited. In their place stood a landscape shaped by human hands, however humbly, for the very first time. And somewhere above that ancient buried riverbed, in a future so distant it could not possibly have been imagined by anyone living along the Thames in the Iron Age, tourists would one day stand beside stone lions and bronze fountains, entirely unaware of the older, wilder lions who had once prowled the very same ground. The river remained, it always would, through everything that was still to come. The marching of foreign soldiers, the rise of great walls, the burning of cities, the tolling of plague bells, the burning of cities, the tolling of plague bells, the roar of fire through timber streets, the hiss of steam, and the glow of gaslight. The Thames would remain the one constant thread running beneath it all, patient and unhurried, exactly as it had been since long before anyone thought to give it a name. It was time now for something new to arrive on its banks, something that would, for the first time, give this stretch of river a name that has echoed down through nearly 2,000 years, carried forward through invasion and fire, plague and rebuilding, all the way to the bustling square that waits for us in the present day. That story begins, as so many great stories of ancient Britain do, with the arrival of ships upon the horizon, and with an empire that had already conquered much of the known world deciding, at last, to turn its attention to this damp, green island at the edge of everything. In the year 43 of the Common Era, the horizon along Britain's southern coast filled with something the local tribes had never seen before. A fleet, vast and deliberate, its sails catching the pale light of a Channel morning. Aboard those ships came the soldiers of Rome, an empire that had already swallowed much of the known world, and now turned its gaze toward this damp green island at the edge of everything. We cannot know exactly what the Cativellani or the other tribes of southern Britain felt as they watched those ships draw closer. Perhaps curiosity, perhaps dread, perhaps simply the quiet recognition that the world they knew was about to change forever. The Roman legions came ashore with the calm efficiency of an army that had done this many times before, and within a few short years much of southern Britain lay under the control of the Emperor Claudius. But conquest, as the Romans well understood, required more than soldiers. It required infrastructure. It required roads, and roads required a way to cross rivers. And so, as Roman engineers studied the wide, winding Thames, their eyes settled upon a particular stretch of the river, a place where the water narrowed just enough, where the banks rose just high enough above the marsh to make a crossing possible. This was not, by any obvious measure, a remarkable location. It was not a place of dramatic cliffs or sweeping views. It was, if anything, rather ordinary, a patch of relatively dry, gently sloping ground on the northern bank, close to where several old trackways converged before continuing on toward the rest of Britain's interior. But ordinary was exactly what the Romans needed. A place that could be bridged, defended, and built upon without excessive difficulty. A place where the tide still allowed seagoing ships to reach inland, yet where the river was narrow enough for a wooden bridge to span its width. And so, by the year 47 of the Common Era, just 4 years after the first Roman soldiers had waded ashore, a new settlement had begun to rise upon that gentle slope above the river. Its name was Londinium. The origins of that name remain, even now, something of a mystery. Some scholars believe it derives from an older, pre-Roman word, perhaps describing the place itself, or some feature of the landscape long since forgotten. We do not know for certain, and perhaps we never will, but the name endured, carried forward through 2,000 years of history, long after the empire that gave it voice had crumbled into ruin. Imagine, if you will, standing on that riverbank in those earliest years. The air would have smelled of freshly cut timber and turned earth, of pitch and rope from the shipyards, of wood smoke drifting from newly dug hearths. A wooden bridge, simple but sturdy, now spanned the Thames at the settlement's edge, the first crossing this stretch of river had ever known. Carts rumbled across its timber planks, connecting the new town to roads that stretched outward across the province, roads that would eventually reach every corner of Roman Britain. Londinium itself was small in these early years, remarkably small by modern standards. The settlement occupied a space of perhaps half a square mile, an area not much larger than what we now know as London's Hyde Park. A visitor could have walked from one end of the town to the other in roughly half an hour, weaving between workshops and warehouses past the muddy banks where boats unloaded their cargo. It sat on the north bank of the river, in the district that modern Londoners would recognize today as the City of London, the very ground where St. Paul's Cathedral now stands. But small did not mean insignificant. From the very beginning, Londinium was built with purpose. Roman surveyors laid out its streets in a careful grid, gravel-paved and well-drained, a stark contrast to the muddy trackways of the countryside beyond. Along these streets rose wooden buildings at first, simple in construction, but gradually replaced or supplemented by structures of brick and stone as the settlement grew in wealth and confidence. And grow it did. The location proved, just as Roman engineers had hoped, to be ideal. Ships could sail up the Thames from the open sea, their holds filled with wine from Gaul, olive oil from the Mediterranean, fine pottery, glassware, and other goods that no province on the edge of the empire could easily produce for itself. At the wharves along the riverbank, the air would have carried the mingled scent of these imported treasures, the sharp tang of wine spilling from broken amphorae, the rich, earthy aroma of olive oil, the faint mustiness of grain, sacks stacked high, awaiting distribution inland. Merchants haggled over prices in accented Latin, their voices mixing with the older British tongues still spoken by many who had lived in this land Long before the Romans arrived, soldiers off duty and restless wandered the streets in search of food and drink. Enslaved laborers, forced to migrate alongside their masters from distant corners of the empire, unloaded cargo along the wharves, their presence a quiet, uncomfortable reminder that a life of comfort in Londinium often came at the direct expense of another's freedom. By the 2nd century of the Common Era, Londinium had transformed almost beyond recognition from its humble riverside beginnings. Estimates suggest the population may have reached as many as 60,000 people, a staggering number for a settlement that had begun as little more than a bridgehead barely a century before. It had become, by this point, unmistakably a city, and one of considerable importance within the wider Roman world. At the heart of this growing city stood its forum, a broad open square, surrounded by shops and civic buildings, where the business of daily life unfolded amid the clatter of cartwheels and the calls of vendors. Nearby rose the basilica, a vast structure housing law courts and civic administration, so large in its dimensions that it ranked among the largest buildings anywhere north of the Alps. Picture it rising above the surrounding rooftops, its walls faced with pale stone, its interior echoing with the footsteps of magistrates and petitioners moving between marble columns. Elsewhere in the city stood temples dedicated to Roman gods, their facades gleaming marble white in the pale English sun, a strange and beautiful transplant from the Mediterranean world onto this cooler, damper island. There was an amphitheatre as well, where crowds gathered to watch spectacles of a kind Britain had never witnessed before Roman rule. Terracotta roof tiles, warm orange-red against the grey northern sky, covered many of the finer buildings, a small but constant visual reminder of the empire's Mediterranean origins, transplanted here to the banks of a cold northern river. Londinium in these years was very much a melting pot, cosmopolitan in a way that might surprise those who imagine ancient Britain as isolated or uniform. From studies of skeletal remains and DNA analysis conducted many centuries later, we now know that many of the city's inhabitants had come from continental Europe, while others carried ancestry from the Middle East or North Africa. Soldiers had been posted here from distant provinces. Merchants had settled here in pursuit of trade and opportunity. Some had come freely, drawn by the promise of a growing, prosperous city. Others, as we've already noted, had no choice in the matter at all, brought here in bondage to serve the households and businesses of those with greater power. This blending of peoples, willing and unwilling alike, would prove to be an enduring feature of London's long story, repeated again and again across the centuries that followed. But growth, however impressive, does not proceed forever without interruption. This would not be the last time that Londinium's fortunes turned sharply and dramatically for the worse. Around the year 60 of the Common Era, disaster struck in the form of open rebellion. Udica, queen of the Iceni tribe, led a furious uprising against Roman rule, provoked by the brutal treatment of her people and the seizure of her family's lands. Her forces swept across the countryside with devastating speed, and Londinium, still a young and largely undefended settlement, lay directly in their path. We cannot know exactly what those final hours were like for the people of Londinium as word spread. that Boudicca's army was approaching. Some fled, others, perhaps, chose to stand and defend what they had built. But the city itself had no walls in these early years, no stone defences to hold back the tide of rebellion. When Boudicca's forces arrived, they burned Londinium to the ground. Archaeologists working many centuries later would uncover the physical evidence of that destruction. A distinct layer of scorched red earth and ash buried deep beneath the modern streets of the city of London, marking the precise moment when the young settlement was reduced to fire and ruin. It remains there still, quietly preserved beneath layers of later rebuilding, a dark scar in the soil marking one of the earliest catastrophes in London's long story. And so, within barely 2 decades of its founding, Londinium had already experienced the pattern that would come to define so much of its future: growth, followed by catastrophe, followed, in time, by rebuilding. This would become a pattern repeated again and again in London's long life, a rhythm as constant and enduring as the tides of the river itself. The city did rebuild, slowly at first, but with growing confidence. Londinium rose once more from its own ashes. New buildings replaced the old. Trade resumed, the wharves once again filled with ships bearing wine and oil and pottery from across the empire. And by the height of the 2nd century, as we have already seen, the city had grown grander than ever, its population swelling toward that remarkable figure of 60,000 souls. Yet the story of catastrophe was not quite finished. In the second half of the 2nd century, another disaster struck, though the details remain frustratingly unclear even now. A major fire seems to have swept through much of the city once again, and some evidence suggests the possibility of plague occurring around the same period. Whatever the precise cause, the population of Londinium contracted noticeably in the years that followed. Once again, expansion followed by disaster, followed by a long, patient period of recovery. It was in the wake of these repeated troubles that Roman authorities made a decision that would leave a mark on London's landscape lasting nearly 2,000 years. Around the year 200 of the Common Era, construction began on a massive defensive wall encircling the city. Built in response to the growing threat of Saxon raiders striking from across the North Sea, this wall would eventually stretch for more than 2 miles, rising in places to a height of 6 meters, enclosing an area of roughly 330 acres. Picture the labour involved: stone quarried and hauled from distant sites, teams of workers labouring for years to raise this great barrier around the city's edge, a physical statement of permanence and protection. The wall did not merely defend against outside invaders. It defined, for the first time, the very shape of the city itself, a boundary that would echo through every shape of the city itself, a boundary that would echo through every subsequent era of London's history, its footprint still faintly traceable in the modern city of London today. For a time, behind this new wall, Londinium settled into a more modest but stable existence. It never quite regained the prostrate grandeur of its earlier peak, but it remained the capital of Roman Britain, a place of continued importance even as the wider empire itself began to show signs of strain. That strain by the early 5th century, had become impossible to ignore. The Roman Empire, stretched thin by economic troubles, political instability, and repeated attacks from barbarian tribes along its distant frontiers, could no longer spare the resources to defend every province. In the year 410, when the people of Britain appealed to Emperor Honorius for military assistance, he declined to send it. It was, in effect, the end of Roman rule in Britain. The years that followed remain frustratingly obscure to historians, a genuinely murky period with little written record and only fragmentary archaeological evidence. We do not know precisely what happened within Londinium's walls in the decades immediately following Rome's withdrawal, but we can imagine with reasonable confidence a city gradually emptying of its former purpose. Without the wealth, trade networks and administrative structure that Roman rule had provided, deterioration was all but inevitable. Picture then the slow quiet of those decades, buildings once grand now falling into disrepair, roof tiles cracking and slipping, weeds pushing up through the gravel streets that Roman engineers had once laid with such precision. The great wall still stood, but grass and bramble crept along its base. The forum, once bustling with merchants and magistrates, grew silent. Somewhere, perhaps, a few stubborn residents remained, tending small gardens amid the ruins of a city that had once housed 60,000 people. Eventually, it seems even this last presence faded, and Londinium was left to the fog and the encroaching wilderness, its walls standing empty and silent above the slow, patient river that had first drawn the Romans here nearly 4 centuries before. But abandonment, as London's long story would prove, again and again is rarely the final word. Somewhere beyond those crumbling walls, new arrivals were already beginning to make their way along the Thames, drawn by the same river, the same gentle slope of land that had first attracted Roman engineers so long before. They would not choose to occupy the old Roman ruins directly. Not yet. Instead, they would settle nearby in a new location, giving rise to a very different kind of town, one built not of stone and marble, but of timber, thatch and quiet, patient trade. Picture, if you can, the old walls of Londinium, many decades after the last Roman legions had departed. Fog gathers thickly along the riverbank at dawn, curling through empty gateways where soldiers once stood guard. Bramble and nettle push up through cracked gravel streets. The basilica, once among the grandest buildings north of the Alps, stands roofless now, its timbers long since rotted or stolen for firewood, its stone walls slowly disappearing beneath a green tide of ivy. The great forum, where merchants once haggled over wine and pottery, has fallen utterly silent. Somewhere within those crumbling walls, foxes make their dens among tumbled masonry, and birds nest in the hollow eyes of temples abandoned to the damp English weather. We cannot know precisely when the last inhabitants left, or whether anyone lingered on among the ruins at all, but by the 6th century it seems the old Roman city stood largely empty, a ghost of stone and memory beside the ever-flowing Thames. And yet London, as a place, as an idea, was far from finished. New settlers had, by this time, been arriving in Britain for generations. They came from the Germanic lands across the North Sea, from territories we now call Germany Denmark, and the Netherlands, and history would remember them as the Anglo-Saxons. Some had perhaps arrived even while Roman authority still nominally held, slipping quietly into a province already weakening at its edges. But it was during the 5th and 6th centuries that their settlement of Britain truly took hold, and over the 500 years that followed, they would shape this island in ways that endure even now. When these new arrivals turned their attention toward the Thames, they made a curious choice. Rather than occupying the old Roman city directly, with its useful stone walls and half-ruined grandeur, they settled instead just beyond it, a short distance to the west. We cannot say for certain why they made this decision. Perhaps the old ruins felt haunted, unsettling in their scale and mystery, evidence of a power the newcomers did not fully understand. Perhaps it was simply more practical to build fresh on open ground than to clear centuries of rubble. Whatever the reason, by the late 7th century, a new settlement had taken root along the riverbank, and it bore a new name. London Wick. London Wick. The name meant, roughly, London trading town, and it suited the place well. London Wick occupied the ground we now recognise as Covent Garden, spreading along the north bank of the Thames, in the area later known as the Strand, a name that itself simply meant riverbank or shore. Unlike the stone grandeur of old Londinium, this was a settlement built almost entirely of timber and thatch. Wooden wharves extended out into the river's muddy shallows, their pilings driven deep into the silt to hold firm against the tide. Great halls of timber, their roofs thick with thatch, housed merchants and craftsmen, while smaller huts clustered along narrow lanes worn into the earth by generations of foot traffic. Imagine standing on the riverbank at London Wick on a grey morning, mist still clinging low over the water. The air would carry the mingled scents of wood smoke and drying fish, of wet wool and freshly tanned leather. Boats bobbed at the wharves, their hulls low and broad, built for trade rather than war, unloading pottery from the Rhineland, fine cloth and other goods drawn from trading partners across the North Sea. Sheep and cattle were driven through the muddy lanes toward market stalls, while weavers worked wool into cloth destined for sale, both locally and abroad. It was, in its own modest way, a cosmopolitan place, connected by water to trading partners across a surprisingly wide stretch of northern Europe, and as had been true in Roman times and would remain true for centuries afterward, not all who lived and worked within London Wick did so freely. Slaves were bought and sold here as well, a grim continuation of patterns established long before the Anglo-Saxons ever arrived on these shores. We do not know a great deal about daily life within London Wick, for written records from this period remain scarce, and much of what once stood here has long since vanished beneath later centuries of building. But archaeological traces, gravel surfaces worn smooth by countless footsteps, fragments of imported pottery, the post holes of vanished timber halls suggest a settlement that grew steadily in size and importance across the 7th and 8th centuries. Iron grey skies pressed low over thatched rooftops. Forest green woodland still crowded close along parts of the riverbank beyond the settlement's edge. This was a quieter, humbler London than the one the Romans had built, but it was, in its own right, alive. That life, however, was about to be disrupted by a new and terrible presence upon the river. Beginning in the late 8th century, longships began to appear on the misty waters of the Thames, their carved wooden prows cutting through the fog, their broad sails catching whatever wind the northern sky offered. These were Viking raiders sailing from the fjords and coastlines of Scandinavia, and their arrival would bring a long, painful chapter to the story of London. We can imagine the terror those first sightings must have provoked among the people of Londonwick, a settlement built almost entirely of timber and thatch, with no stone walls to offer protection, no fortifications of any real substance, stood almost entirely defenseless against raiders who came swiftly, struck violently, and vanished back downriver before any organized resistance could be mustered. Throughout the 9th century, these raids grew increasingly frequent and increasingly destructive. Holes were burned, goods were plundered, residents who could not flee in time faced violence, or worse. Each time, it seems, the town endured what damage it could and attempted some manner of recovery, only to face renewed attack in the years that followed. This was, once again, that same pattern echoing forward through the centuries. Growth interrupted by catastrophe, followed by whatever rebuilding proved possible. But, unlike the Roman city before it, Londonwick possessed no great wall behind which its people might shelter. Its vulnerability was total, and by the later decades of the 9th century, it had become clear that something had to change if London, in any form, was to survive the age of the longships. That change came under the Prast. That change came under the rule of a king whose name would echo through English history for more than 1,000 years afterward, Alfred the Great. Around the year 886, Alfred made a decision that would reshape the very geography of London for centuries to come. Rather than continuing to defend the exposed, starps, undefended settlement of Londonwick, he chose instead to abandon it and reoccupy the old Roman city. Just to the east, the long empty ruins of Londinium, still ringed by their ancient defensive wall. Here, at last, we return to that wall first raised by Roman hands nearly 7 centuries earlier, the same wall that had once enclosed a bustling city of 60,000 souls, then stood empty and overgrown through generations of silence and decay. Though weathered by centuries of neglect, its stones still stood firm enough to offer real protection, a defensive barrier far superior to anything the timber town of Londonwick could ever have provided. Alfred ordered the old walls repaired and strengthened, closing gaps, restoring gateways, preparing the ancient fortifications to serve a new purpose in a new age. Under his direction, the focus of London's settlement shifted decisively back within those Roman walls, and the city took on a new name to mark this new beginning. Londonburg, meaning, roughly, London Fortress. We might pause here and reflect on the quiet strangeness of this moment. The same stone walls that Roman engineers had raised to defend a Latin-speaking city of togas and terracotta roof tiles now rose again to shelter an entirely different people, speaking an entirely different tongue, worshipping an entirely different god. Centuries after the empire, that built them had vanished from Britain altogether. The wall itself did not care who it protected. It simply endured, patient as the river beside it, waiting through centuries of silence for a purpose to find it once again. This return to the walled city marks, in many ways, the true beginning of London as a continuous, unbroken settlement, the origin point of the specific district that Londoners today still call the City of London. To a remarkable extent, its boundaries even now trace the rough outline of those ancient Roman defences, a ghostly footprint persisting through more than 1,000 years of subsequent rebuilding. Life within Londonburg remained, by later standards, a precarious business. Viking raids continued through the following century, and London's defences, however improved, were tested again and again. In the early 11th century, during an assault led by the Norwegian king Olaf II, London Bridge itself may have been destroyed in the fighting, its timbers pulled down or burned during the chaos of battle. Some historians believe this dramatic event. The collapse of the bridge amid Viking assault may lie behind the origins of the well-known nursery rhyme describing London Bridge falling down, though we cannot say for certain how directly the two are connected. The population of this Anglo-Saxon London, even at its height, remained modest when set beside the glory of Roman times, reaching perhaps no more than 15,000 residents, roughly a quarter the size of Londinium at its 2nd century peak. Its buildings, too, could not compare to the marble temples and grand basilica of the Roman era. This was a city of timber halls and thatched roofs, of narrow lanes rather than paved grid streets, humbler in every visible way than the city that had stood on this ground centuries before. And yet, behind its restored walls, Londonburg endured. Trade slowly resumed, markets reopened along streets first laid out by Roman hands. Hearth fires glowed within timber halls, built atop the foundations of vanished Roman houses, their smoke rising to mingle with the same low fog that had drifted over this river for thousands of years, long before any human name had ever been given to it. Picture then this reoccupied walled city as darkness falls across the Thames. Firelight flickering behind wooden shutters, smoke curling upward into a cold night sky. The ancient stones of the wall standing silent guard against whatever might yet come sailing up the misty river. It was smaller than Rome's city had been, poorer in many ways, and still vulnerable to the raids that would trouble England for generations to come. But it was alive, it had returned, and within these old Roman walls, the city that would one day stretch far beyond anything Alfred could have imagined had, once again, quietly begun to grow. There is a particular kind of stillness that settles over a city in the hours before its world changes forever, and on a cold October night in the year 1066, that stillness lay heavy over the walled streets of London. Word had already reached the city from the coast near Hastings. King Harold, crowned only months before, lay dead upon the battlefield, struck down alongside his brothers, and the flower of his household guard, the man who had defeated him, Duke William of Normandy, was already marching toward London with an army that had proven itself unstoppable. The city that had endured Roman fire, Saxon resettlement, and generations of Viking raids now faced a new kind of reckoning, one that would not simply pass through and leave, as the longships once had, but would remain and rule and reshape the very skyline along the river. We cannot know precisely what fear moved through London's narrow lanes in those uncertain weeks. Perhaps merchants hurried to secure their goods behind shuttered doors. Perhaps priests offered quiet prayers within the timber churches that dotted the city. What we do know is that London's citizens, along with the surviving nobility of England, eventually submitted to William's rule, and by Christmas Day of that same year, he was crowned king within the walls of Westminster Abbey, a building only recently completed under the pious direction of Edward the Confessor. William did not trust this city easily, nor should he have. London had grown wealthy and proud behind its ancient Roman walls, and a conquering king newly arrived from Normandy understood well enough that wealth and pride could curdle quickly into rebellion. And so along the river's edge, at the southeastern corner of the old Roman wall, William ordered the construction of something London had never quite seen before. A fortress built not of timber in the old Anglo-Saxon fashion, but of pale, quarried stone, rising story upon story above the rooftops of the wooden city below. This was the beginning of the Tower of London, and at its heart stood the structure that would come to be known as the White Tower, its walls faced in creamy Kentish ragstone and fine corn limestone shipped across the channel from Normandy itself. Picture it rising against the grey river mist of an English morning, pale and severe, utterly unlike anything the wooden streets of London had known before. Where the old Roman wall had stood as a boundary, a line of defence encircling the whole city, this new tower stood instead as a statement, a single, deliberate assertion of power planted directly beside the river, watching over the city rather than merely enclosing it. We might imagine the ordinary residents of London gazing up at this structure as it slowly took shape across the following years, watching stone by stone as something entirely new asserted itself upon a skyline that had until now been dominated by thatch and timber and the ancient, weathered line of the Roman wall. This was Norman authority made visible in the plainest possible terms, a fortress that could serve as royal residence, garrison, treasury, and when necessary, prison, all within the same forbidding walls. And so, as the decades turned into centuries, London settled into a new rhythm of life under Norman and then Plantagenet rule, and the city itself began to grow in earnest, filling out the space within its ancient walls and spilling gradually beyond them. Imagine walking through medieval London on an ordinary morning, centuries after William's conquest. The lanes are narrow here, barely wide enough for 2 carts to pass, and the timber frame buildings on either side lean inward slightly at their upper floors, as though the whole street were gently closing over your head. Wood smoke hangs thick in the air. Drifting from countless hearths and workshops, mingling with the smell of the river at low tide, that particular mineral tang of mud and salt and decaying vegetation that Londoners have breathed for as long as there has been a London at all. Church bells ring somewhere across the rooftops, and then are answered by another bell and another, until the whole city seems to hum with the sound of them. This was by the height of the medieval period, a city crowded with churches, well over 100 parish churches, packed within and around the old Roman walls, their bells marking the hours of prayer and work and rest for a population that had grown once again, had grown once again into the tens of thousands. Market cries rise above the general clatter of the streets, fishmongers calling out the morning's catch fresh from the Thames, bakers advertising warm bread, cloth merchants displaying bolts of wool dyed in shades of red and blue and yellow. The streets themselves are a dense, layered world of overlapping lives. Apprentices hurrying on errands, clergy moving between churches in their dark robes, beggars huddled in doorways, merchants haggling loudly over the price of grain or timber or fine imported spices. And running through the very heart of all this activity, spanning the river itself, stood one of medieval London's most extraordinary structures, London Bridge, not simply a crossing, but a small town unto its sides, lined on both sides with houses and shops that rose several stories high, their upper floors overhanging the river below, creating a strange enclosed tunnel of commerce stretched across the Thames. Picture standing at its centre, unable even to glimpse the water flowing beneath your feet, surrounded instead by butchers and haberdashers and moneylenders conducting their business exactly as they might on any ordinary street, except that beneath the floorboards, the tide of the river rushed endlessly onward toward the sea. This bridge had, of course, a long history of its own, rebuilt more than once since the days when Viking raiders had torn down its wooden predecessor centuries before. The version that now stood, begun in the final years of the 12th century, was built of stone, sturdy enough to last for thanks generations, its 19 arches straddling the river, with a permanence the old wooden crossings had never managed to achieve. Beyond the bridge, beyond the crowded lanes of the walled city, two great centres of power had, by this period, firmly established themselves along the river, standing as twin poles around which London's medieval life revolved. Stood Westminster, to the west stood Westminster, to the west stood Westminster, where Edward the Confessor had built his grand abbey in the years before the Norman Conquest, and where, in the centuries that followed, kings would be crowned and Parliament would gradually take shape as an institution of English governance. Westminster represented royal and political authority, a seat of power distinct from, though intimately connected to, the commercial heart of the city further east. And within the old walled city itself rose St. Paul's Cathedral, not yet the great domed structure that later centuries would come to know, but a vast Gothic building of stone, its spire reportedly among the tallest in all of Europe, piercing the smoky London sky, and visible for miles along the river. This was spiritual authority made manifest in stone and glass, a building around which the religious life of the city organized itself, its bells among the loudest and most commanding of the 100 or more churches scattered throughout medieval London. Between these twin centres of power, Royal Westminster and spiritual St. Paul's, the dense, layered life of medieval London unfolded along the river's edge, a city now home to tens of thousands of souls, its population having grown steadily across the 11th, 12th and 13th centuries, filling the space within the old Roman walls, more fully than it had been filled since the height of Roman rule itself. We might notice, gently, an echo here of that earlier chapter in London's story. Once again, this ancient walled boundary, first raised by Roman hands, then abandoned, then restored under Alfred the Great, now found itself containing a bustling, prosperous, densely packed city, its population pressing outward against the very stones that had once been built to keep danger out. But London, as we have already learnt across the earlier chapters of this long story, has rarely been permitted to enjoy its prosperity without interruption. Growth would once again give way to catastrophe, following that same pattern first traced in the ashes of Boudicca's rebellion. Then again in the burning halls of Creusd, Londonwick, and this time the catastrophe that awaited London would not come by fire, nor by invading army, but by something far smaller and far more terrible. In the year 1348, a sickness arrived in England that would come to be known in the centuries afterward as the Black Death. We cannot know exactly how it first entered London, though most accounts suggest it arrived by ship, carried perhaps unknowingly along trade routes that had, for centuries, been one of the city's greatest strengths. The very connections that had allowed Londinium to import wine from Gaul, that had allowed Londonwick to trade pottery with the Rhineland, that had allowed medieval London to grow wealthy on wool and cloth and spice, now became the pathway through which this invisible catastrophe travelled. The disease spread with a speed and lethality that must have seemed, to those living through it, almost impossible to comprehend. Contemporary accounts describe entire households falling ill within days, sometimes within hours of one another. Doors were shuttered. Streets that had, only weeks before, echoed with market cries and church bells fell into an eerie, unfamiliar silence. Picture, if you can bear it, a city accustomed to constant noise and motion, suddenly stilled. The narrow lanes once crowded with apprentices and merchants and clergy now stood largely empty, save for those tasked with the grim business of removing the dead. Carts moved slowly through the streets in the early morning hours, collecting bodies from households too devastated to manage burial on their own. Plague pits were dug hastily on the outskirts of the city, mass graves intended to accommodate a death toll that far exceeded what ordinary parish churchyards could ever have managed. We do not know, even now, precisely how many Londoners perished during this first terrible wave of plague, though estimates suggest that within the city and its surrounding areas a very substantial portion of the population, quite possibly close to half, may have died within a period of little more than a year. It is a staggering figure to contemplate, and one made all the more haunting by the fact that many of those plague pits still lie beneath the modern city, their locations only occasionally rediscovered during construction work. Centuries later, layers of quiet grief buried beneath parks and squares that Londoners today cross without any awareness of what rests below. There is a strange solemn echo here, if we allow ourselves to notice it, reaching all the way back to the very beginning of this story. Just as the bones of lions and hippopotamuses lay forgotten beneath Trafalgar Square for over 100,000 years before anyone thought to dig them up, so too do these plague pits lie quietly beneath the modern surface of London, hidden layers of the past resting undisturbed beneath the ordinary business of contemporary life. The city, it seems, has always carried its history downward as much as it has carried it forward, each generation building, quite literally, atop the remains of those who came before. For a time, following that first terrible wave of 1348, London must have felt like a city holding its breath. Trade slowed, markets that had once bustled stood half empty. Many of those skilled in particular trades, weavers, brewers, carpenters, had died alongside everyone else, leaving gaps in the city's economic life that would take years, in some cases decades, to fully repair. And yet, London did recover, as it always had before, and as it would again in centuries still to come. This too was part of that same enduring pattern, first established in Roman times, catastrophe, followed eventually by renewal, growth reasserting itself gradually. After even the most devastating interruption, the plague would return in smaller outbreaks. Across the following decades, a grim reminder that this particular danger had not vanished entirely, but the city's fundamental resilience, its position on the river Pa, its accumulated wealth and trade connections ensured that London's long-term trajectory remained one of continued growth. Slowly, the bells began to ring again with something closer to their old rhythm. Markets reopened, first cautiously, and then with growing confidence. Then with growing confidence, as merchants and craftsmen who had survived the plague's worst ravages returned to the business of buying and selling, building and trading, living the layered, crowded life that London had always demanded of its residents. Streets that had stood empty and silent slowly filled once more with the familiar sounds of medieval urban life. The cries of fishmongers along the riverbank, the clatter of cartwheels over cobblestones, the murmur of Latin prayers drifting from church doorways, mingled now with English, French, and the countless regional dialects of merchants and travellers drawn to the city from across England and beyond. It is worth pausing here to imagine that recovery, gentle and gradual, unfolding across the years and decades following the plague's worst devastation. Imagine the city almost exhaling after a long held breath, its rhythms slowly returning, its population slowly rebuilding, its markets and churches and crowded lanes reclaiming, bit by bit, the life that had briefly been silenced. By the later medieval period, London stood once again as one of the great cities of Europe, its walled boundaries still tracing that same ancient Roman footprint, first laid down more than 1,000 years before, its bridge still spanning the Thames with its curious town of shops and houses balanced above the water, its twin centres of Westminster and St. Paul's still anchoring the political and spiritual life of a city that had now survived Roman fire, Saxon resettlement, Viking raids, Norman conquest, and the worst plague Europe had ever known. The White Tower still stood, pale and watchful beside the river, its stone walls unchanged by the centuries of turmoil that had unfolded around it. The old Roman wall, weathered but enduring, still marked the city's ancient boundary, a quiet witness to everything that had happened within its embrace since Alfred the Great had first ordered its restoration centuries before. And the river, as it always had, continued to flow past all of it, indifferent to conquest and plague alike, carrying its slow grey current toward the sea, exactly as it had done, since long before any human being had ever stood upon its banks and imagined a city taking shape there. London had survived. It had grown and burned and grieved and rebuilt, following that same ancient rhythm that had shaped its story from the very beginning. And though no one living within its crowded, smoky streets could possibly have known it, yet the city's greatest trial by fire, quite literally, still lay several centuries ahead, waiting patiently in the future, much as those ancient bones had once waited patiently beneath the ground, for the moment when its story would turn once again. By the time the Tudor dynasty took the throne in 1485, London had grown into something its Roman founders could scarcely have imagined, and yet the river remained exactly as it had always been, wide, silver grey, and endlessly patient, curling past the old stone bridge and beneath the pale walls of the tower. Picture the Thames on a bright summer morning during the reign of Henry VIII. The water is crowded with wherries, small rowing boats, ferrying passengers from bank to bank, their oars flashing in the sun. Grander vessels move more slowly, barges gilded and draped in velvet carrying courtiers and ambassadors between the royal palaces that now lined the river's edge. This was the age of river pageantry, when the Thames itself became a kind of royal highway, its surface catching the deep reds and golds of noble banners, its banks lined with crowds gathered to watch a king or queen pass by in state. Along the water stood a scattering of grand palaces, each competing in its own way for royal favour. Westminster remained the seat of government, as it had been since the Confessor's time, but new residences had risen alongside it. Hampton Court, further upriver, spread its red brick courtyards and tall chimneys across manicured grounds. Greenwich, downstream, offered another royal retreat, its gardens sloping gently toward the water. Whitehall, nearer the old city, grew steadily into a sprawling complex of halls and lodgings. The river connected all of them, a liquid thread stitching together the scattered centres of Tudor power. But beyond the palaces, beyond the velvet and gilt of royal barges, the ordinary city continued its older, humbler rhythm. Behind the ancient line of the Roman wall, London had grown dense with life, its population climbing steadily through the 16th century toward, and eventually well beyond, 100,000 souls. The narrow medieval lanes remained largely unchanged in their layout, still winding and cramped, still lined with timber-framed houses whose upper stories leaned out over the street below, blocking much of the daylight from ever reaching the cobblestones. This was, in its own way, a beautiful city, rich with colour and texture, painted shop signs swinging above doorways, striped awnings shading market stalls, the deep brown of oak timber framing plastered walls, the colour of cream and pale ochre. Yet beneath that surface beauty lay a growing and increasingly dangerous truth. London, behind its old wall, had become a city built almost entirely of wood. Houses were framed in oak and infilled with wattle and daub, their roofs thatched with straw, or, in slightly grander homes, covered with wooden shingles. Chimneys, where they existed at all, were often crudely built, prone to sparks escaping into the open air. Streets were narrow enough that fire could leap easily from one building to the next, timber eaves nearly touching across the gap. Warehouses along the riverside stored pitch, tar, timber, and oil, materials essential to a thriving port city, and each one a silent invitation to catastrophe. London, in short, had spent more than 1,000 years quietly assembling all the conditions necessary for a truly terrible fire. It simply had not happened yet. Before that reckoning into the past, before that reckoning arrived, however, the city would face once more an older, familiar enemy, the same invisible catastrophe that had devastated it 3 centuries before. In the year 1665, plague returned to London in a wave that would come to be remembered as the Great Plague, much like the Black Death of 1348. It seems to have arrived by ship, carried unknowingly along the very trade routes that had made London prosperous, and much like that earlier outbreak, it spread through the city with terrifying speed, moving from household to household, parish to parish, with a relentlessness that overwhelmed every effort to contain it. Picture the summer streets of that year, usually alive with the noise of commerce, falling instead into a hush broken only by the occasional creak of a cart wheel or the low murmur of prayer. Doors marked with a red cross became a common and dreaded sight throughout the city, a warning painted or chalked upon the timber to signal that plague had entered that particular household, and that its occupants were now confined within, forbidden to leave, forbidden to leave. Watchmen were posted outside these marked doors, tasked with ensuring the quarantine held, however cruel or futile that confinement might sometimes prove. At night, the silence broke in a different way. Death carts moved slowly through the empty streets, their wheels rattling over cobblestones, drivers calling out for households to bring forth their dead. We can imagine the flicker of lantern light against timber walls, the low mournful sound of a bell rung to announce the cart's approach, and the terrible ordinary business of loading bodies, wrapped in whatever cloth a grieving family could spare, onto a growing pile within the cart's wooden bed. These bodies were carried, as they had been 3 centuries before, to hastily dug pits on the city's outskirts, mass graves that would, centuries later, occasionally resurface during construction work, to another quiet layer of grief settling beneath the modern city's streets. By the time this particular wave of plague finally receded, tens of thousands of Londoners had died, a devastation that echoed, with grim familiarity, the same pattern of catastrophe, first etched into the city's story by Boudicca's fire, by Viking raids, by the Black Death itself. Growth interrupted by disaster. It had happened before. It would happen again. But few among the survivors of 1665 could have guessed just how soon, nor in what form the next catastrophe would arrive. The following year, in the early hours of the 2nd of September, 1666, a small fire broke out in a bakery on Pudding Lane, near the northern end of London Bridge. We do not know precisely how the fire began, though the most common account suggests a spark from the bakery's ovens, left smouldering overnight, caught among nearby stores of firewood and kindling. Whatever its exact origin, the fire that began in that modest building would, within a matter of hours, become something far larger and far more terrible than anyone could have imagined. London, as we have already seen, was a city built almost entirely for exactly this kind of disaster. Dry summer weather had left the timber framework of the city's houses parched and brittle. A strong east wind was blowing that night, and it caught the flames from Pudding Lane and carried them swiftly toward the densely packed streets nearby. Warehouses along the riverside, stocked with pitch and oil and stacked timber, ignited with terrifying speed, feeding the fire fuel it hardly needed. Picture, if you can bear its terrible beauty, the fire as it began to spread across those first days, a roaring wall of orange and gold rising above the rooftops, moving with a speed that outpaced every attempt to contain it. Firefighting in this era relied largely on pulling down buildings ahead of the flames to create fire breaks, a slow and often desperate measure that proved almost useless against a blaze moving this quickly. Church spires, dozens of them scattered across the old walled city, caught alight one after another, their wooden frames collapsing into showers of sparks that the wind carried onward to kindle still more distant streets. Merchant houses, guild halls, and humble timber cottages alike were consumed without distinction, the fire showing no more regard for wealth or status than the plague had shown the year before. Thousands of Londoners fled toward the river, the one clear boundary the fire could not easily cross. Picture the Thames that week, its surface crowded with boats of every kind, small wherries and larger barges alike, packed with families clutching whatever possessions they had managed to save. From the water, they watched their city burn, a vast, terrible glow, lighting the night sky, smoke billowing upward in columns, so thick that by some accounts they could be seen for many miles in every direction. The heat, even from a safe distance on the water, was reportedly intense enough to be felt clearly upon the skin. Among the buildings lost was old St. Paul's Cathedral, that great Gothic structure whose spire had, for centuries, pierced the London skyline, visible for miles along the river. The medieval cathedral, already weakened by years of poor repair, proved no match for the fire's intensity. Its roof collapsed, its stone walls, weakened by the extraordinary heat, cracked and crumbled. The building that had stood at the spiritual heart of London since the days of the Norman kings was reduced within days to a smoking, broken shell. For 4 days the fire raged largely unchecked, consuming an enormous portion of the old walled city. When it finally burned itself out, having run out of fuel as much as having been contained by any deliberate effort, the destruction it left behind was almost impossible to comprehend. An estimated 80% of the city of London lay in ruins. Thousands of homes had been destroyed. Dozens of churches, including Old St. Paul's, had been reduced to rubble. And yet, remarkably, the recorded death toll remained relatively low, though historians have long suspected that the true number of casualties, particularly among the poor whose deaths may have gone unrecorded, was likely far higher than official accounts suggest. In the days and weeks that followed, Londoners returned, cautiously, to survey what remained of their city. Picture the scene. Smoke still curling upward from smouldering ruins. Picture the scene. Smoke still curling upward from smouldering ruins, the air thick with the acrid smell of burnt timber and scorched stone, familiar streets rendered suddenly unrecognizable, reduced to fields of ash and rubble, stretching from the tower in the east nearly to the old western edge of the wall. Somewhere beneath all that ash and broken stone lay the blackened remains of medieval London, a city that had endured Roman fire, Viking raid, and Norman conquest, now finally undone by a bakery oven and an east wind. And yet, as had happened so many times before across this long and layered history, catastrophe gave way, in time, to renewal. Various grand plans were proposed for a completely redesigned city. Wide boulevards and elegant piazzas, replacing the tangled medieval street plan entirely. Most of these ambitious schemes, however, proved impossible to realize. Property boundaries, ownership disputes, and the simple economic necessity of rebuilding quickly meant that London's rebuilt streets would in large part, follow their old medieval routes, if somewhat widened and straightened where possible. But while the street plan survived in something close to its old form, the materials of the city itself would change forever. New building regulations required brick and stone, rather than timber for the walls of London's rebuilt houses, a direct and deliberate response to the disaster of 1666. Streets were widened where circumstances allowed, and provisions were made for improved access to the river for firefighting purposes. Slowly, deliberately, London rose again, this time built to resist the very disaster that had just consumed it. At the heart of this rebuilding effort stood one figure whose name would become permanently linked to London's recovery: the architect Christopher Wren. Wren was given responsibility for rebuilding dozens of London's parish churches, each one designed with careful attention to proportion and light, their spires rising once again above the rebuilt rooftops in a rhythm of towers and steeples that gradually restored something of the city's old skyline, even as the buildings themselves reflected an entirely new architectural sensibility. But Wren's greatest task by far was the rebuilding of St. Paul's Cathedral itself. The old medieval cathedral was gone beyond any hope of repair, and Wren was tasked with designing something entirely new to rise upon its ancient foundations. What he produced was unlike anything London had seen before. A vast domed cathedral in the classical style. Its proportions drawn from the great churches of Renaissance Italy, rather than the Gothic tradition that had shaped old St. Paul's. Construction proceeded gradually across several decades, the great dome slowly taking shape above the rebuilt city, until at last, in the early years of the 18th century, the new St. Paul's Cathedral stood complete. Picture it, rising above the rooftops of the rebuilt city, its pale dome catching the light in a way the old Gothic spire never had, a structure that felt less like a continuation of medieval London and more like a deliberate statement that the city had survived its greatest trial and emerged transformed. Wren's work did not erase medieval London entirely. Rather, it rose through the ruins, blending ambition with the practical compromises that rebuilding always demands. The result was a conversation, in stone and brick, between what London had dreamed of becoming and what London could realistically achieve. By the early decades of the 18th century, the fire that had once threatened to end London's long story had instead become, in hindsight, another chapter in that same enduring pattern: growth, catastrophe, and renewal repeating itself once again. Just as it had after Boudicca's rebellion, after the Viking raids, after the Black Death. The city that rose from the ashes of 1666 was a fundamentally safer one, its streets, built from brick and stone, rather than timber and thatch, its skyline crowned by Wren's new dome, rather than the old medieval spire. The river continued to flow past it all, exactly as it always had, carrying trade and travellers toward a city that had, once again, proven its remarkable capacity to burn, to grieve, and to rebuild itself, layer upon layer, atop everything that had come before. London's streets, wider now and paved more securely against fire, settled into a new and more permanent kind of calm, and though no one strolling past Wren's gleaming new cathedral could have known it yet, this fireproofed city, rebuilt so carefully from ash and ambition, was only just beginning the next great chapter of its long and layered story, one that would soon see it grow far beyond anything even Wren himself might have imagined. By the early decades of the 18th century, London had settled into something approaching calm. Wren's new dome rose pale above brick rooftops, and the fear of another great fire receded gradually into memory. It was during this Georgian era that the city discovered a gentler kind of growth, one measured, not in ash, but in elegant proportion. Picture the new squares that began appearing beyond the old Roman wall: Bloomsbury, Grosvenor, Bedford, each one framed by rows of red brick townhouses painted here and there in soft pastel render, their facades ordered and restrained in a way medieval London had never been. Wrought iron railings lined pavements where none had existed before. Inside warm, candle-lit rooms, and within the coffee houses that had begun spreading through the city, merchants and writers and gentlemen of business gathered over steaming cups to exchange news, gossip, and the shipping prices arriving daily from the docks. This was expansion of a quieter sort, gradual and genteel, London stretching outward across fields that had, within living memory, still belonged to farmers. And then, as the 18th century turned into the 19th, everything accelerated. The Industrial Revolution arrived in London not as a single event, but as a slow thickening transformation, and by the reign of Queen Victoria, the city had become something almost unrecognizable from its Georgian self. Population soared past 1 million, then 2, climbing steadily toward numbers no European city had ever sustained before. Row upon row of soot-blackened tenements rose in the East End, packed tight against factories and workshops that never seemed to stop producing smoke. That smoke gathered, night after night, into the fog for which Victorian London would become notorious, a thick, yellow-grey haze, thick, yellow-grey haze, thick, further, by coal smoke pouring from countless chimneys, so dense at times that gas lamps had to be lit at midday. Beneath those lamps, railway viaducts now cut boldly through neighbourhoods that had stood since medieval times, brick arches striding across rooftops, carrying trains towards stations that had not existed a generation before. Down at the docklands, forests of masts and funnels crowded the river, ships arriving from every corner of a growing empire, their holds filled with tea, spice, timber, and wool, echoing, in a way, those long-ago wharves of Roman Londinium and Anglo-Saxon London Wick, where cargo had once arrived from Gaul and the Rhineland. It was amid this vast, smoke-wreathed expansion that a new civic monument took shape. one intended to celebrate an empire's naval glory. In the 1840s, construction began on Trafalgar Square, its broad paving laid out to honour the victory at Trafalgar, Nelson's column rising skyward, bronze lions eventually settling at its base. And here the circle closes. For beneath that very ground, beneath the fountains and the pale stone lions, lay the same ancient riverbed where, more than 100,000 years earlier, real lions and hippopotamuses had once waded through a warmer, wilder Thames. Growth, catastrophe, renewal. This had always been London's rhythm, and here it curved back upon itself entirely. Empire built, unknowingly above prehistory. The Thames still flows on tonight, silver grey beneath electric light, where gas lamps once glowed, patient as ever, carrying London's story quietly onward, layer upon layer, waiting for those who pause to listen.
There is a particular kind of wonder that comes from standing on a platform deep beneath London streets, waiting for a train. The air is warm and slightly stale, carrying that distinctive underground smell that Londoners know instinctively, a combination of dust and electricity, and something older and harder to name, as though the earth itself is breathing gently through the tunnels. The tiles on the platform walls are curved, precise, familiar. And somewhere, not far beneath your feet, the same ancient soil that once cradled Roman pottery and medieval plague pits continues its patient, unbroken sleep. The underground, as Londoners call it, opened its first line in January 1863, making it the oldest subway system in the world. Picture the occasion. A train propelled by steam engine, smoke curling upward into a tunnel built just beneath the surface, passengers packed into wooden carriages and emerging, blinking, into daylight at either end. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary achievement, and an entirely London achievement, born of the same restless civic ambition that had built the new docks, the railway viaducts, and the grand Victorian townhouses spreading outward across the old fields. For many Londoners of 1863, it must have felt like something close to magic. A journey that had once taken 40 minutes by horse-drawn omnibus now took a fraction of that time, carried underground through the earth at speeds that seemed almost miraculous. The city was once again transforming itself from within. Above ground, that transformation continued just as restlessly. The Victoria Embankment, built in the 1860s and 1870s, finally tamed the northern bank of the Thames in a way no previous generation had managed, reclaiming land from the river's edge, laying sewers beneath, planting plane trees along the new riverside walk. The engineer Joseph Bazalgette, whose name most Londoners today have never heard, oversaw the construction of a sewer network so extensive and so well designed that it solved, almost overnight, the problem of waterborne disease that had plagued the city for generations. It was unglamorous work, invisible to almost everyone who benefited from it, and yet it may have saved more London lives than any other single project in the city's long history. The river that had once carried the waste of millions now ran somewhat cleaner, and the cholera outbreaks that had periodically devastated the city's poorer neighbourhoods grew rarer, then stopped altogether. Once again, London had responded to catastrophe, in this case the slow catastrophe of disease and filth, with practical, unglamorous, and ultimately transformative rebuilding. By the dawn of the 20th century, London stood as the largest city on Earth, its population approaching 7 million people, its empire stretching across continents and oceans. Its streets were thick with horse-drawn traffic giving way gradually to motor cars and omnibuses. Its skies were thick with the last of the Victorian coal smoke, the famous London fog beginning at last to soften as cleaner fuels slowly replaced the old. And then came the wars. The First World War touched London in ways the city had never been touched before, with bombs falling from airships in the darkness overhead, a new and disorienting kind of violence arriving from the sky rather than across the river or along the roads. But it was the Second World War and the Blitz of 1940 and 1941 that brought London face to face with destruction on a scale not seen since the Great Fire of 1666. Night after night, German aircraft arrived over the city, their engines a low, distinctive drone that Londoners quickly learned to recognize and dread. Bombs fell across the East End and the city and beyond, reducing whole streets to rubble, opening craters in roads that had followed their medieval routes for 500 years. St. Paul's Cathedral, rebuilt so carefully by Wren after the Great Fire, became a symbol of resistance, its dome visible above the smoke and flames of burning buildings. Photographs of it surviving the Blitz circulated across the country and the world as evidence that London had not been broken. In the underground stations, thousands of Londoners took shelter each night, sleeping on platforms and in tunnels beneath the streets, living that strange, compressed life of wartime underground, the city above them burning while they waited in relative safety below. The same tunnels that had been built to carry commuters to work now sheltered families from the sky. It is impossible not to hear in this another echo of the city's long pattern. Catastrophe arriving once again with shocking speed. The city's people enduring, adapting, finding whatever shelter they could beneath whatever remained standing. And then, in time, the slow work of rebuilding, clearing rubble, filling craters, restoring streets and buildings as resources and energy allowed. The London that emerged from the Second World War was changed in ways that went far deeper than bomb buildings and cleared rubble. The decades that followed brought new arrivals from across the former empire, from the Caribbean, from South Asia, from Africa and the Middle East, adding new voices and communities to a city that had always, since Roman times, been a place where different peoples from different places arrived and made their lives alongside one another. The same process that had once brought enslaved labourers from distant provinces to Roman Londinium, that had drawn Rhineland merchants to the wharves of Londinium, that had made medieval London streets ring with French and English and Latin all at once, continued in new forms, reshaping the city's neighbourhoods, its cuisine, its music, its face. London, in other words, remained what it had always been, a city shaped by arrival, by movement, by the constant coming and going of people drawn to the same river bend that Roman engineers had once chosen for its practical virtues. The city changed around them. The river did not. And so tonight, if you were to stand at the edge of Trafalgar Square as darkness falls, watching the fountains catch the last light and the stone lions settle into their evening stillness, you would be standing atop more than 100,000 years of layered time. Beneath your feet, the bones of lions and hippopotamuses from a warmer, wilder world. Beneath those, the gravel terraces where early humans camped beside a braided river. Above those, the ashes of Boudicca's rebellion, the post holes of Roman warehouses, the scorched earth of a city burned and rebuilt. Above those, plague pits from 1348, from 1665, each holding their quiet grief beneath the pavement. Above those, the ash of the Great Fire, the foundations of Rennes' rebuilt city. Above all of that, and still rising, the city of today, breathing and moving and impossibly alive. This is London, a city that has burned and been rebuilt, that has been conquered and reconquered, that has endured plague and fire and war and flooding, and each time found its way back to the river and begun again. The Thames does not care about any of this, of course. It flows on exactly as it did before any of it happened, carrying its grey current seaward, patient and indifferent as it has always been, since long before anyone thought to give it a name. But we care. That is, perhaps, what makes us human. The ability to stand above the bones of ancient lions in a square named for a naval battle, beneath a statue of an admiral gazing out over a city that has forgotten more history than most places ever accumulate, and feel, even faintly, the weight of all that time. London endures. It always has. The city of London has always known how to endure. Through Roman fire and Viking raids, through plague and conquest, and the great burning of 1666, through 2 world wars and the Blitz, it has always found a way to rebuild itself and carry on. What makes London remarkable is not any single moment of glory or catastrophe, but the accumulation of all of them together, layer upon layer of history, pressed down beneath the streets, waiting quietly in the dark for whoever thinks to look. The Thames does not judge this history. It simply carries it forward, as it has always done, from the first prehistoric hunters who camped on its banks to the millions who cross its bridges every day without a second thought. It did not care about empires. It did not pause for plagues. It flowed on through the years of the Great Fire, its surface lit orange by the flames consuming the city on its northern bank, indifferent to the catastrophe unfolding above its waterline. It flowed on through the Blitz, its dark surface reflecting the searchlights and the distant glow of burning buildings, carrying fireboat crews toward the docks in the same quiet way it had once carried Roman galleys and Viking longships. Tonight it flows still, beneath bridges that have replaced bridges that replaced earlier bridges, past embankments built upon the remains of older embankments, beside a city that has remade itself so many times that the version standing now bears almost no visible resemblance to the version that stood here 1,000 years ago, and yet carries within its very streets and place names and buried foundations, an unbroken thread of continuity, stretching back to those first Roman surveyors who chose this particular bend in the river as the place where everything would begin. That is London's true monument. Not any single building, however grand. Not any single reign, however long. Not any single disaster, however devastating. It is the continuity itself, the unbroken thread, the fact that people have lived and worked and argued and grieved and celebrated and gone about the ordinary business of their lives in this particular place, beside this particular river, without interruption, for nearly 2,000 years. Somewhere in the city tonight, a light is still on. Someone is still awake, looking out over rooftops toward the river, thinking whatever thoughts people think in the small hours, unaware that they are standing in a place where countless others have stood before them, Across every century since Rome first drove its stakes into the Thames mud and called this bend in the river home, the city breathes around them. The river moves below, and London, patient and enduring as it has always been, settles into another night, another layer of its long and extraordinary story quietly beginning to form. The streets of London carry their history in their very names. Bread Street, Milk Street, Cheapside, each one a small piece of memory, worn smooth by 1,000 years of daily use. Walk through the city on a quiet Sunday morning, when the financial district stands empty and still, and you can almost hear the older city beneath the modern one. The weight of all those centuries pressing gently upward through the pavement beneath your feet. This is what makes London different from almost anywhere else on earth. It does not simply remember its past. It lives inside it. Every generation that has walked these streets has added something to what came before, and every generation that follows will walk above what we leave behind. The Thames carries all of it forward, patient and unhurried, moving through the city the way time itself moves, quietly, steadily, without ever quite stopping. It did not pause for Roman emperors. It did not slow for Viking longships. It did not stop for the plague carts moving through empty medieval streets in the darkest hours of the night. It simply flowed on, as it always has, as it always will. Somewhere tonight a light still burns above the river. Someone still awake in the small hours, looking out across the rooftops toward the water, unaware of everything that rests beneath their feet. The Roman roads, still faintly traceable beneath the modern streets. The medieval plague pits, lying quiet and undisturbed beneath parks and pavements. The ash of the great fire pressed deep into the soil beneath the rebuilt city. The foundations of a place that has refused again and again and again to disappear. London has burned. London has been conquered. London has been emptied by plague and shattered by bombs falling from a night sky. And every single time, it has gathered itself back together, cleared the rubble, rebuilt the streets, reopened the markets, and carried on. Not because London is invincible, but because the people who have always lived here have refused, generation after generation, to let it go. That stubbornness is London's greatest monument, more lasting than any building, more enduring than any wall. It is written not in stone, but in the simple, repeated fact of the city's survival. 2,000 years of it, and counting. The river moves on tonight beneath electric light where gas lamps once glowed, past bridges that have replaced bridges that replace bridges, past a skyline that has changed beyond all recognition, and yet still follows faintly the same ancient curves of land and water that first drew people here so long ago. London endures. It always has. And tonight, wherever you are listening from, the city is still there beside its ancient river, still breathing, still building, still adding one more quiet layer to its long and extraordinary story. The Thames flows on. Sleep well.